Hello, everyone. I know that you were able to see us from some minutes now, so thank you so much for your patience and for waiting. As you know, my name is Leticia Berrisbeitia, and I'm part of the facilitation team of this training of trainers for gender equality. And I'm very, very glad to welcome you today to this session, online session, on the working paper series, Feminist Approaches to Training for Gender Equality. On the next slide, I want to share with you briefly how is the session of today organized? How is it going to go? So thank you. We have here a content map, so we're right now in the opening, of course, and I will share with you some thoughts on how to interact through this platform because we want to make this as interactive as possible. And I will also have the pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Lucy Ferguson, who's also on the screen right now. And well, on the moving on, Lucy, for the next content slot. Yes, we will have a brief overview of the working paper series that Lucy will share with us. But most importantly, what we're going to do is framing this discussion through questions. Questions that, as gender trainers, we surely have made ourselves or probably will. So what we want to do is answer some questions, if you can go on with the content map, Lucy, on change and pedagogies, thank you, and finally resistances. So we'll frame the discussion of the usefulness of the working papers around these questions. We also had we'll also devote some time at the end for an open Q&A if you have any questions yourself or also any concerns about the face-to-face week next week that we're going to meet here, or anything else you want to bring up. So moving up to the next slide. And we did wanted to share this logistics slide with you because, well, this GoToWebinar platform is a bit different from the one we saw before from the WebEx. And you can interact with us through this platform in two ways. You cannot share your cameras, but you can write at any time during this presentation through the chat box, and you can see the chat box right in the menu bar that you have on the right side of your screen that should look like the one you have now on the slide. So our colleague Sabrina, who you also met last week, as she is also a participant of this ToT, she's there in the chat all the time and backstopping and sharing and she will be sharing your questions, so you have the option to write them there. Another option we have for interaction today is raising your hands. You will also see there's a little hand on the gray menu bar on the small one. Yeah, thank you, Lucy, that's it. And you can use that little button there to let me know that you want to interact with us using your microphone. So when this happens, during the time when we will make the questions, please make sure to raise your hand so I can see you and unmute you and you can share. So that's how is this going to go. I also wanted you to know that we are recording this webinar and it will be available through our YouTube channel, but also through your eCampus space at the ITC-ILO campus. And finally, if you are experiencing any connectivity issues, for example, low bandwidth, or if you cannot hear us very well, you should try in the upper menu bar that you have like just above our images here, there's an option to hide webcams or to only view who's talking. So that's a way of improving the connection most of the time. In any case, if you're having any difficulties, please contact us through the chat at any time, as I said. So moving on to the next slide, I am very, very happy to be able to introduce you today to Dr. Lucy Ferguson. Lucy, sorry, I have my notes here. She has a very extensive resume, so I want to get it right. Lucy Ferguson is a researcher, consultant, and trainer in gender equality. She's a research associate at the Gender Center of the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. Her recent publication on gender training include Gender Training, a Transformative Tool for Gender Equality, and that's Palgrave Pivot Gender and Politics Series, July 2018. So that book is from this very year. And we will share this presentation so you can have also that link if you're interested. And the Politics of Feminist Knowledge Transfer, Gender Training and Gender Expertise, co-edited with Maria Bustelo and Maxine Forrest, also from the same editorial house. So, well, more about Lucy. She has worked on gender training with a range of organizations, including UN Volunteers, Commonwealth Secretariat, and Universidad Complutense de Madrid. She has collaborated with the Young Women Training Center for several years now, and a range of projects, including producing the working paper series that we're presenting today, the working paper series on training for gender equality. And her current research interest is transformational change for gender equality in the UN system. So I don't want to take any more of your time. I want to leave the floor to Lucy now.
Thank you, Leticia. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Training Centre colleagues for inviting me to participate in this session today and be part of the Training for Trainers, which you will be doing the in-person, face-to-face part of next week. So I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to the working paper series so that we can move this webinar on to a more interactive session to discuss some of the issues that the working paper series raises. The background to the series is really with the overall aim of developing some evidence-based, practice-informed research on specific pertinent topics for the field of training for gender equality. And moving on from that objective, the Training Centre has published a number of reports and articles and manuals, some examples of which are the 2015 paper, which is Training for Gender Equality 20 Years On, which charts the evolution of training for gender equality from Beijing 1995 up until Beijing plus 20, and pulls out some key aspects there for looking at. The next main publication was the Compendium of Good Practices, which was developed through an open call and then a participatory approach with interviews with the representatives of various good practice, and then some kind of loose criteria there for what we might call a good practice in training for gender equality. Other publications include the Gender Equality Capacity Assessment Tool, the Manual on Training for Gender Equality, and also the Typology of Training for Gender Equality, which explores the different kinds of activities and types of training contexts that we include under the umbrella of Training for Gender Equality. So building on this work, it was decided at the expert group meeting in Santo Domingo in August 2015 that there were some kind of key questions and key issues that it was really time to start addressing in terms of the kind of analytical and methodological work that we do on training for gender equality. And out of those meetings came a series of recommendations. And that's where the impetus for the working paper series came from. And the two key objectives of the working paper series are to inform training centre practice as one goal, and secondly, to promote an engaged debate and exchange among key stakeholders in the field, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers and training commissioners too. There's a common conceptual approach which ties together the different papers in the working paper series, and I'll talk you briefly through each of those papers in a moment. First of all, there's a common normative thread, which is, first of all, a commitment to training for gender equality as a transformative practice. By transformative practice, we mean something that is explicitly built on two pillars. One is it's built on a feminist critique. That is, it challenges the basis of all knowledge and ways of knowing. And secondly, training for gender equality is a feminist project, which means that it aims to transform oppressive and interlocking power relations in pursuit of a world characterized by increased social justice. So that's the normative thread going through all of the working papers. and then more specifically a methodological approach in terms of how the papers were developed. But first, the aim was to contextualize the issues in broader debates from practice and also academic research in the field. So importantly, bringing together academic research and practitioner writings, literatures, publications in order to kind of get a broader analysis of the field. And then secondly, for each paper, what specific challenges arise in the case of training for gender equality when looking at this area? And for many of the specific areas of the working papers, there isn't a huge amount of literature to draw on. So a lot of that work is about kind of drawing on the work from practice and trying to set out what the key questions are. The third question is very much practice focused. So how can these questions and these commitments and principles be applied in practice at all stages in the training cycle? And then finally, each paper includes a statement to elaborate the training centre's position on this specific topic. The idea of these statements is that they kind of condense the main ideas and the main positioning of the paper into 1 or 2 pages and allow these statements to be put out into the field for further discussion and debate. So that's a brief introduction to an overview. I'm just going to pass back now to Leticia for a moment.
Thank you, Lucy, for that wonderful introduction. So we want to warm up a little bit with you all and encourage participation with a couple of poll questions that we have prepared. So I'm going to take control of the screen now, Lucy, and project them. Okay, wait a moment, please. Just a moment. Okay. I'm almost there now. Okay, now here you go. We have question number 1 and up. So you should be able to see now on your screens a question that says, when did you last conducted a training? In the last 6 months, in the last year, in the last 2 years, or never? So we would appreciate if you can answer that quick question. We are receiving now your replies. Keep voting, please. Okay, we're almost there. A few more seconds to reply. Okay, perfect. Now we're going to put the poll down. Any more answers? Good. So I'm closing now. And she's going to share the answers. Okay, we're sharing the poll results now. Sabrina, could you kindly read the results for us?
Yes, so the majority answered in the last 6 months, and then equally in the last year or never. So no one has last conducted training in the last 2 years, but yeah, mostly in the last 6 months.
Mostly in the last 6 months. So thank you so much for that. So that's interesting. We have a group with a lot of experience in majority, but also like variety in the group. So that's very good. So we can learn from each other, right, Lucy?
Yeah, great.
So I'm going to put up question number 2. You should have it now on your screens. And the question says, how confident do you feel about yourself as a trainer for gender equality? So the options are quite comfortable, not very comfortable, and don't know. So please let us have your replies. Keep voting. Okay. Replies are coming up. You still have a couple of seconds to reply. Very well. Keep them coming. Okay. I think we're almost there now. Super. So I'm closing the poll and sharing the results. And Sabrina, if you can read it for us, please.
Okay, so, oh wow, so 50% are feeling quite comfortable, so that's good news. And then not very comfortable, 33%, and don't know, 17%. So that's good, I think, right?
Yeah, that's excellent. It's great. This like to get to know you and the group a bit better. So what are your thoughts, Lucy?
Well, I think it's clearly an interesting mix of people, and it's interesting that in the discussions now that we move on, then we can have an exchange between those who are more experienced in practicing gender training and perhaps more experienced in reflecting on these questions, and perhaps some people who have had less time to think about these questions. So I think it's a nice mix of people, and hopefully we can get some interesting discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that discussion will take place here and also during next week and throughout the coaching phase. So that's also great news for us. So I believe we can move on with the presentation. Lucy, I'm going to return the screen to you.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Okay.
And
Okay,
make
so
sure
thank
to
you for
share.
those
Yeah.
interesting answers to the questions, and I like that poll feature. I think it works well. I'm just going to give you now a brief overview of the papers. I understand that Leticia has shared the papers with you and also the executive summaries. So if you have chance at least to read the executive summary of each paper, I think that hopefully that will leave you quite well equipped for engaging with some of these debates and ideas next week in the face-to-face sessions. So I'm just going to today quickly talk about 4 of the papers. The evaluation paper, the 4th paper, is not yet publicly available. It's just in the final design phases. I think it's almost ready to be published, and I think that you also have a copy of that. So there's another paper as well on education, but on training and education, but these 4 papers are the ones with the most substantive practice-based questions for training for gender equality. The education paper is perhaps more of a positioning paper or an analytical paper. So I thought we would look just at the key points of each of these 4 papers today. The theory of change paper, first of all, sets out how the different aspects and processes of training for gender equality support the impact of training. And it helps to try to understand what training can change and in what time frames, short term, medium term, long term. And it also tries to place these debates within a notion of transformative change. At the end of the theory of change paper, there's a proposed theory of change for training for gender equality, which again is open to comments, drafts, responses, and is very much posited as a participatory process in looking together at how we might understand change from the perspective of training for gender equality. The second paper is on feminist pedagogies, and this paper takes 4 key principles from the literature on feminist adult education and develops those in terms of specifically looking at training for gender equality. There hasn't been a huge amount of literature on feminist pedagogy specifically for training for gender equality. So a lot of that paper is taken from the feminist adult education literature and then transposed into some of the specific challenges that are present in gender training scenarios that are not necessarily present in more of a long-term adult education setting. The Feminist Pedagogies paper works in line with the UN Women Training Centre's commitment to participatory, non-hierarchical and power-sharing learning. And that's kind of the ongoing theme throughout that paper. The idea of the Feminist Pedagogies paper is that it can accompany, it's more of an analytical background to the training centre's existing work, for example, the manual, the typology. So it's a kind of like more analytical background to some of the more practice-focused work that's produced by the training centre. Third, the quality paper explores questions about how do we understand quality in training for gender equality. What does that mean? What might be the key criteria for quality? and what kinds of quality assurance mechanisms can be put in place in order to begin to work towards some kind of quality guidelines in the loosest sense, or working more forward, would it be something like a certification? So it explores those different kinds of ideas and also the politics of what it means to define quality and develop these quality assurance mechanisms. And the paper on evaluation, as I said, is the most recent of the papers and is just would be published later this year. The idea of the evaluation paper came from the fact that there is, again, very little substantive material on specifically evaluation of training for gender equality. So the evaluation paper draws on UN Women literature on gender responsive training, and also more broadly on feminist evaluation, gender transformative evaluation, and uses those principles and specifically applies them to the context of training, of evaluating training for gender equality, and sets out some ideas for how some gender transformative evaluation can be integrated into all phases of the training cycle. And just a little more content before we go on to some discussion questions. There are really three key themes that tie the papers together and that can be brought out of the papers. First of all is the importance of the training cycle when looking at any aspect of training for gender equality. So making sure that, for example, evaluation is not just thought about at the evaluation stage, pedagogies are not just thought about at the content development and curriculum development phase, that in order, the quality is not just something that's looked at the beginning, that in order for any, for training for gender equality to be a transformative process, all of these aspects need to be considered at all stages in the training cycle. And that's something that's included in all the papers. How do we take these points into consideration at all the different phases in the training cycle? The second point is an understanding of training for gender equality as an ongoing and cyclical process. So it's trying to get away from a linear understanding of change, a linear understanding of the relationship between training and change, and trying to make that more complex and more grounded in the literature on change, so that we can start to think about what we're changing and how. And finally, a really important point, going back to the publication, The Typology of Training for Gender Equality, is that, as you will already know, and as you will learn more next week, the context of a training for gender equality can be so diverse. You can be anything from a very short one-off session or a very practical session which needs to impart specific technical details, to a much longer engaged process of institutional change. So the importance really is that whenever we're talking about these different questions and different challenges of training for gender equality, that we always acknowledge the specific context of each training scenario, so that we can get the most effective and transformative results from the training, whilst acknowledging the specific contours and parameters of any training scenario. So I'm happy to answer any questions on any of this, but now I'd like to ask you a question, please. So this is going to be our first question for the day, and that is, what can training for gender equality change? What can training for gender equality change?
So, Lucy, if I may jump in for a moment there, I just want to remember all participants that they can participate through the chat box, writing what they think about this question, and also they can raise their hands with a little button. It's a rounded button above the GoToWebinar menu, so I can see you and you can share your thoughts with your microphones. So, well, I really like this question, Lucy, because when you work on this, you really wonder, no, like, what kind of impact are you having in the wider scale? Because we always say that we think from the individual, but we aim to the transformative, right? So I think it's a great question.
So while you're pondering your answers and writing some answers or any points, any experiences to share on that question, I wanted to talk you through something that we look at in the Theory of Change paper, which was developed by Myra Marks-Free, which is the KDA approach to change. And this is an idea that effective training that can actually contribute to change can only work when these three factors come together. So knowledge is something that depends on imparting the knowledge, imparting specific knowledge on gender, and then, but moving on from that, there's a desire to learn and desire to engage with the facts and a desire to make the required changes both at the individual and institutional level. And then the third point, the ability, is that actually participants in training, having conducted a training and even with a good understanding and a good grasp of the knowledge and a desire and commitment to move forward with gender equality practices, that they actually have the capacity to do those in terms of time, in terms of institutional resources, and importantly in terms of management support within the institution to go ahead and apply their knowledge. So as Leticia was saying, we also need to think at the kinds of levels that we want to change. This KDA approach is clearly about individual change, or how individuals can effect change. So is training for gender equality aiming to change attitudes? Is it aiming to change behavior? And a more broad question, does training for gender equality aim to change individuals or institutions, or both? And if both, then what's the difference between those, and what different kinds of pathways might there be to different kinds of change?
Yeah.
Lucy, if I can just quickly jump in. So we have two participants who replied to the question, or three actually. So Rebecca said knowledge, desire, and abilities. So kind of what you were just saying on your PowerPoint presentation. And then we have Felipe, who's saying, so the awareness of people towards oppression issues, gender gap, and inequalities in general between men and women. And then Teresa, gender equality can change the lives of people who suffer from discrimination. It can change society by giving the same opportunities to all human beings. So yeah, that's the three replies we got just now. Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, very much focused on the KDA approach and the individual aspect of change. Any thoughts on how training for gender equality can contribute to institutional change?
Sabrina, I believe we have another question through the chat box. I only wanted to say that you're feeling shy. Just please feel welcome as well to raise your hands and discuss with us, to join the conversation. But yes, Sabrina, go ahead and read the question, please.
So it's a question from Elizabeth. So she says, good morning. I have a question. I will try to ask it in a clear manner. So Lucy says that the research work on training for gender equality is based a lot on theory on adult training. Gender equality is a priority for the 2030 agenda, but for instance, ecology is also another big challenge, which requires that as human beings, we should interact differently with our environment. Here comes the question. Do you think we could learn also from other fields on how to be transformative in our trainings? Would it be helpful to engage other fields in our reflections?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that's perhaps where we can go next in terms of trying to understand the areas in which we may be a little stuck in training for gender equality. We've been doing this kind of training for a lot of years now, and I think that even just reading from different fields, for example, from privilege studies or from theatre studies, can give us really fresh ideas about how we can change our approach and what we can learn from other fields. So if we had the time and if we made the time and space to do that, then yes, I think there's absolutely a lot to learn in cross-fertilization. And I think gender experts are often kind of not accused of, but we have to be aware that we're not necessarily engaging broadly with other fields as well. So it's certainly, I would say, on the wish list, yes.
Well, I believe it's time to move on to the next question, Lucy. I
Okay.
just wanted to say to everyone that we can keep the discussion if you want to bring something up that you feel it was left behind. So please keep sharing your thoughts with us. So let's
Okay,
move on.
thank you everyone for your contributions. The second question relates to pedagogies, and I explained a little bit about the background of the pedagogy working paper. So the question is, what kinds of pedagogical principles and practices are most likely to lead to change? What kinds of pedagogical principles and practices are most likely to lead to change? And while you're ruminating on that, if you have any experiences to share or thoughts to share or questions on that point, I'm going to go through the 4 principles that are included in the working paper on pedagogies and which have been developed beyond this now and picked up quite broadly within the field, I think. These come from Hoffman and Stake, and then we developed them from that work to move them forward to make sense for training for gender equality. Now, regardless of the context, as I was just discussing before, regardless of the context, we believe that these 4 principles can still be engaged to some extent, and that the practices that go with them can still be engaged regardless of the type of training scenario. The first point is participatory learning. Perhaps we can add to this as well experiential learning, the importance of participants being engaged and an open environment, what we call in the paper a feminist classroom, which is an open, non-hierarchical space where everyone feels welcome to learn and encouraged to engage in every form possible. The second point is very important in feminist pedagogy. It's about the validation of personal experience and the inclusion of personal experience into the training. However, as raised in the paper, this can sometimes come into tension with the aims and objectives of a gender training, or more explicitly, the personal and political commitments of the trainer. So a lot of times personal experience might go against the ideas of gender equality. So this is a time when skillful treatment is needed here to help people explore their ideas and their personal experiences and put them in the broader context of structural gender inequalities. So that's a very interesting point, I find, for gender training. The next point is the encouragement of social justice, activism and accountability. So even in a short gender training scenario, how can we motivate people and encourage people to take the things that they are participating in the training further within their own organisation and their lives? And finally, the development of critical thinking and open-mindedness, again, more challenging in some scenarios than others. Many groups come to a training with already a very analytical way of looking at things, and other groups are very much more used to needing practical tools to apply things. So all these four basic principles can be more and less challenging to apply in various different scenarios. So perhaps we'll go back now to the question: what kinds of pedagogical principles and practices are most likely to lead to change? And I'll hand back to you, Leticia.
Thanks, Lucy. Yes, I believe our participants are still ruminating. I still have no raised hands, but I don't know. What about you, Sabrina? Do you have any comments on the chat box?
I have one reply from Teresa. And so she says, I think the most efficient trainings include experiential activities, practical examples, and ludic methodologies. Having fun is a great way to learn. I totally agree with that, Teresa.
Yes, and while you keep thinking there on that, I not only completely agree with Teresa, experiential activities, that's part of validation of personal experience. I would also like to include my own reflections on this, Lucy, as when
Yes,
in the
please.
context of training, we constantly feel that this and it is a commitment, as you say, in the working paper series and in our work to provide this feminist thinking space within the trainings, no? But how to achieve it in the practice to actually move forward towards change or support the change process, no? Because as we know, because of our experience and traditional way of thinking and patriarchy, trainings can be or tend to be a very hierarchical space where someone is like sharing knowledge in a way that's kind of unidirectional. So how to make that space feel different? It's very difficult to achieve, I would say, but very important. And also thinking in the different learning, ¿cómo se llama? Modalities, like how to achieve that in a webinar, how to achieve that in a room, or through a learning space like a chat forum. So that would be like my question and my concern. But I also believe that feminism is this constant question on how to making things different and how to be critical about what you're doing, right? I don't know if we have any other hands raised.
Well, Felipe just wrote saying that experiential learning as well, and make people understand by making exercises leading to incorporate knowledge. In Latin America, we called Educación Popular, but he doesn't know the global name for it.
It's a very good one, yes. What are your thoughts on this, Lucy?
Yeah, I think that the experiential is something different to participatory learning, and it's something different to the validation of personal experience. It's something that goes beyond that. It's something more embodied, and it's kind of what I hope can take us forward to the next level with training for gender equality. I'm interested, for example, in what we can learn from theatre studies and the kinds of theatre and gender equality work that's being done in various spaces, and how we might be able to bring more of that into the training scenario, which helps to develop this idea of the feminist classroom and the development of the critical thinking and open-mindedness by taking people outside of their normal spaces of thinking and being, and really working with experiential learning in the sense that there's a very strong participation, not just through talking, not just through writing, but through more physical work as well. So this is in the early stages of development, but I think there's potentially a lot of cross-fertilization there for how we can trigger different kinds of responses, and how those could perhaps open up more spaces for discussion in a different way to what we've been doing so far.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, I completely agree, and also it's part of the work of the working paper series. This feminist pedagogical one is make the distinction between those kinds of learning, and what you're saying about theater is very interesting, of course. It also has to do with Elizabeth's comment, no, to
Exactly.
taking from other experiences
Mm.
and cross-fertilizing and enriching the training experience. So I believe we can move on as we have no other hands raised or comments, right, Sabrina? So the good thing is also
Okay.
that these questions are building up in a way, right? They relate to each other as
Mhm.
well. So
So the third question is about another theme which goes through all of the working paper series and all of the literature on training for gender equality, which is about resistances. So the question that we have prepared for today, and again, just to say, as Letitia keeps reiterating, these are questions that I hope you will return to next week, and there will be plenty of space to reflect on these kinds of very big questions within training for gender equality. So how do we deal with these resistances in training scenarios? It'd be really interesting to hear any of your experience of the kinds of resistances that you have experienced either as a trainer or that you've observed as a participant in a training scenario. So I'll just give you some small examples while you're thinking about answers to that. The great piece by Lombardo and Megert on identifying resistances really helps us to understand the different kinds of resistances that can be faced. They distinguish between explicit and implicit resistances. So implicit resistances might be just not participating, not paying attention, looking at your phone, and then more explicit resistances would be voicing opposition very clearly and very clearly blocking the training in a very active way. And importantly, their second distinction is between gender specific and non-gender specific resistances. So gender specific might be that participants are just really in disagreement with the idea that gender equality exists, or they are not in favor of promoting gender equality. They don't think it's something that should be prioritized, etc., etc. But then the non-gender specific is also interesting in terms of what kinds of other things people bring to the training that we don't always know beforehand, in terms of things that are going on with their lives or things that are going on within their institution. For example, if changes are going on and people are worried about their jobs, I think in my experience that's a time when people tend to not want to be in a training, and it's not necessarily about gender at all. It can be about other things too. And the other kinds of resistances, apart from individual resistances, is institutional resistances, which is something I developed more substantively in my book. And using the training cycle in my book, I develop the kinds of institutional resistances that can arise at different stages in the training cycle. I'll just read quickly through that, unless there are any questions or points.
yes, we have no hands raised. I believe, Sabrina, we have a couple of comments through the chat box.
Yes. So first we have a question from Elizabeth. So here in your comments, I am asking myself if we are doing the necessary at the training center to be inclusive in our papers so that we enrich them with experiences from all the globe. Just a remark. What do you think, Lucy?
Well, I think if I remember correctly, when we were at the expert group meeting, we had this idea about a kind of global peer review type system and developing a network, and we wanted to pass the papers out and try and get a more participatory response. But those kinds of things are difficult and they take resources and time. So I think that, I think it's the right time now for some attempt to perhaps publicize these in a more popular way and try and engage the ideas and get some critical feedback on the ideas that are here, and also try and gather more experiences from more fields and more geographical spaces and different voices to enrich the papers. Certainly that's something I think that would be really valuable. but the practical steps of that, I'm not sure how we can do it or how we should do it.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another comment from Teresa regarding the resistance. So she says making the people who are resisting participate, make them feel the training, involve them in considering their personal background, their lives, and obviously understanding why it is that they're resisting by answering their questions and concerns.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. I think there's a danger of kind of demonizing resistance when we talk about resistances to gender training, and I think it's important that we remember that resistance is part of the necessary process of learning and contestation. There's no transformation without resistance. There's no transformation without contestation and dialogue. So, excuse me, it's not that resistance in itself is negative, but it is challenging and sometimes can completely derail an entire training. So the point is, as gender trainers, how do we keep hold of the scenario, and how do we flip those resistances from negative resistances into productive resistances? How do we make these into productive tensions? And that's not always easy. I think I would definitely recommend the reading of the report from the virtual dialogue that we did and the webinar that we did on resistances a couple of years ago, because that included lots of really good examples from practice and from different aspects of practice on how to deal with resistances. And I think we're still building up this repository of really good sometimes tools, techniques and strategies on dealing with these resistances, and trying to get to the point with understanding that these resistances are the essence of gender training. And if we want any change, we need to really grapple with these kinds of situations.
And thanks so much for that, Lucy. I believe we can go on with the institutional resistance, as we want to leave also some time for the open-ended questions.
So do you want me to read the slide, or shall we just move on to the next?
And no, because we interrupted you right when you were about to read the slide, so maybe you can share it as well.
So just to be clear, this isn't from the working paper series. This is after further work on some of these ideas from my book, this diagram. So at the analysis and planning stage, institutional resistance can show itself in terms of insufficient funds, insufficient time or personnel dedicated to gender mainstreaming or training, the exclusion of non-hegemonic voices, and the refusal to make certain information public. So working with imperfect information and only hearing a small range of voices from the institution. In terms of the design and development stage of the training cycle, institutional resistance can come in the form of externalization, which is very much about, oh no, well, gender's not about what we do in our organization. Gender's about the work that we do outside. We don't need to talk about it in our own internal processes. Again, moving on to management structures, how difficult it is to challenge male privilege in the management structures of organizations, the gender imbalance, both in terms of who comes to the training, usually women, and who's in charge of implementing it and taking this further in a serious way, usually men, internal policies and procedures, bureaucracies, and requests for technocratic fixes, in the sense of like, no, we don't want to talk about all of this. All we want is for you to talk about the tools. We just want the tools. We don't want the other stuff. We just want the tools. In terms of implementation, this is kind of was alluded to in the previous slide, and it's about when participants feel that they are completely constrained by whatever their institutional context is to really do anything with what they're learning and experiencing and developing in the training. And finally, in terms of evaluation, it's really important that internal issues and power dynamics are included in the training's design and development, so that these can then be evaluated at a later date. What I mean by that is that the impact of training is very much conditioned by the broader institutional circumstances, context, and historical trajectory. So it's very important, I think, that those things are included in the evaluation, because if we're going to understand the impact of the training, we need to be clear about what's actually going on in the institution in which we're conducting the training and be able to have access to discuss those power dynamics. So that's really just some tasters on some of the key questions that arise from the working paper series, and I hope you enjoy your week next week and discussing them next week. I'm going to pass those back over to Leticia now.
Thanks so much, Lucy. That's it's a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate that, and you, from all, are the one that's walking us through these papers. Now that we will have more time to read in this through the online space. So while you keep ruminating, dear all, about the questions you may want to ask, we have this is like a 5-minute open space for any question you might have about, well, for Lucy, I'm taking the opportunity that we have her here, or for us regarding the training. I also wanted to, well, as Lucy say, I keep repeating this, but I want to repeat it one more time, that you can bring all these questions or maybe your answers or also your experiences, because I know a bit, I've been getting to know this group through the chat forums and your flyers that you have shared. So I know that you have some specific experiences. So we'd love to hear it. How have you experienced institutional resistances? How have you experienced gender-specific resistances? So, and have you developed any strategy to tackle them? So please also feel free to share anecdotes or stories, and that I'm sure that will enrich this conversation. So I believe, Sabrina, we have one more comment through the chat box. So if you want to read
Yes,
it.
and it's a question from Rebecca. Talking about institutional change, is it a good strategy to incorporate a gender equality approach in all of training programs of an institution in place of providing a specific gender equality training? So that's Rebecca's question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So in a sense, is there a problem with just having gender included in the specific gender training, or should it be kind of mainstreamed throughout all trainings in an organization? I think ideally we would all say both. We should have both. It should be both mainstreamed and standalone. I think the problem of having it as only a small component of every training is that, in my experience, that can just be a very, very small section and a very weak section, and possibly delivered by people who are not very committed to this idea and don't necessarily have the skills to deal with any tensions or questions that may arise there. Ideally, I think a capacity development strategy of an organization would have an online course on gender. On gender, it would have a face-to-face course on gender, and gender would also be mainstreamed into all the different trainings that institution offers. But if I had to choose just one of those, I don't know, it's difficult. I think I would probably always go with the specific gender training, but then it's the issue that we already discussed: who comes to the training and who doesn't come, and are the people who come to a specific gender training necessarily the people who are most able to effect change in the organization?
Thank you. So going on to the next question, it's from Teresa. So in one of the first slides, she saw that there was a manual for gender equality training, but she didn't see the material between the ones we actually sent for this webinar, and she wants to know where to find that publication. Maybe Leticia, you can answer.
Yes, thank you, Sabrina, and thank you. I believe this is Teresa. Yes, for that. We absolutely can share that training manual through the e-learning campus space that's at the ITC-ILO. I inserted quick links. I believe it is already at the resources center, but I make sure to put it right there below the the webinar invitation. So we also have that on our resources center in the Young Women Training Center resources. But what we will do is afterwards this webinar ends, we will post all these links again, including the one we didn't add, and also the presentation that will include links. So yeah, that's great that you want to keep reading and using our manuals and papers. So Sabrina, you can read the next question if you want.
Elizabeth is curious to know if participants of this group systematically do a capacity assessment at the beginning of the training cycle.
Okay, well, also thank you for that, Elizabeth. It would be nice to have a quick poll question on that. We can do that already, but I don't know if you want to share with Elizabeth your experiences with the capacity assessment. If we can also make sure, no, I assure you that we'll address this topic during next week face-to-face, because we will go through the whole training cycle. And as Lucy mentioned earlier on the presentation, it's very important to have like a transversal view of the cycle and not only like a specific focus by part. So it's important to do quality assurance throughout the whole training cycle, and this capacity assessment really allows to many other things to happen later on. So also thank you, Elizabeth, for the reminder. We'll also make sure to add that tool to the presentation and to the forum post for you to have a quick access to it. I don't know, Lucy, if you have anything to complement on this.
Yeah, I just think that you develop the capacity assessment tool. It's something that's in evolution, and again, it's just about the importance of making sure that no stage of the training cycle is skipped, and that all of these aspects are taken into consideration. For example, when we're thinking about capacity assessment, how can we apply feminist pedagogical principles to conducting capacity assessment exercises? And I'm sure these are things that you'll be discussing next week.
Absolutely, we will look out to all of that and more. So let me just do a quick check to see if we have any raised hands. We still don't. Sabrina, do we have any other comments?
No. Oh, no, actually, no, that's all.
Okay, nothing. So, well, I just want to thank you all again for your participation. Also to Sabrina and Lucy for being here, and Lucy for that wonderful presentation. And just ask you that if you want, like as a follow exercise to this online seminar, to bring along any questions or replies to Lucy's question that you have, if you keep thinking about that. We can also take a look at that during Monday on session 1 of the webinar, of the face-to-face, sorry. So I believe that's it for today.
Thank you.
You all for attending.
Thank
you,
you,
Lucy. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Felipe, Rebecca, Elizabeth, and Teresa for your participation. See you soon.